You know, when you look at the way that the SS Sicamous was built, with the knee braces and the vaulted ceiling, the stained glass windows, the gilt treatment around the edge, just, oh, great, great detail. And then you look through the book about the coastal liners of the CPR and look at the same kind of construction techniques were used in it, same kind of vaulted ceiling, knee braces, stained glass windows. The reason is the same man that built the coastal steamships oversaw the building of the sternwheelers on the Okanagan. His name was Captain James Troupe, and tonight on Okanagan Pioneers and Places, we tell you the story of the man who oversaw the building of CPR's steamship lines. Welcome to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with Robert Turner with me, my guest today. Robert Turner's written many books about boats on the coast of British Columbia, and the one that is most recent is those beautiful coastal liners, the story of the CP boats on the coast. But he's with us today because the person who was in charge of those evolutionary days of the CPR boats had a hand in the Okanagan and on the Kootenays as well. And it's a man who I don't think we've talked about adequately. His name is Troupe, Captain James Troupe.
That's right.
Where did he come from, and how did he come to our attention?
James Troupe came from Portland, Oregon. He was born there in 1855. His dad was a riverboat captain, and his grandfather was a deep-sea captain and a riverboat captain too. So he was born to be on the water, and he grew up in the pilot house of the riverboat, standing on an apple box, trying to reach the big steering wheel on the steamboats. It was just, ships were his whole life. He proved to be one of these frontier geniuses, I think, when it came to handling ships. And then later, as he matured in designing and building them, he was a very versatile fellow and had a profound impact in British Columbia.
Isn't it amazing how the CPR always seemed to find these people?
They were very good at that, and people like Troupe were given a lot of flexibility, and even in this big bureaucratic company, I think the CP was good at recognizing the talents it had and giving people the freedom, with some controls, of course, to put their ideas into practice. The Troupe certainly won the respect of management as the years went by, and they respected him and let him set the direction for things.
How did they discover they had him? Because did they buy the company knowing he was in it, or did they buy the company and discover they had him?
Probably a bit of each. He'd established a pretty good reputation by the time he became part of CPR, which was the late 90s. He'd come up to BC in the 1880s during the construction era on the CPR and run steamboats on Shuswap Lake and Kamloops Lake and the Thompson River. Then gone back to the States and come to the Kootenays in the early 90s to run the Columbian Kootenay Steam Navigation Company fleet, which are the boats on the Columbia River and Kootenay Lake. And he'd started building vessels, overseeing the construction then, and I think proven to be a very capable manager. And CPR took over that fleet in '97, and Troupe and the master builders, the Bulger family, and the experienced captains came along with them. They took over the whole operation. So they had a steamship line up and ready to go with very skilled people right in hand. So they got talented staff to start with.
And he put his stamp on which ships, which could be called Troupe ships, T-R-O-U-P-E, Troupe ships.
Well, as far as BC is concerned, he built a few in the States too, but he started with the Nakusp and the Kootenay on the Columbia River service, and then by the late 90s he built the Slocan, which was for Slocan Lake service, and then the Rossland, the Moye and the Minto. They were originally built for the Stikine, and he built a number of ships for that service. Then ones we're familiar with here, the Okanagan was one of his boats. Then Kuskonook on the Kootenay Lake, and then the last 3 big steamships for the interior, the Bonington, the Nasukan, and the beautiful Sicamous that's preserved at Penticton.
And they did evolve, didn't they? Because the Aberdeen wasn't one of his, but it was sort of the first boat on the lake. And
Yes.
then they became ship-like. They became elegant.
Yes, the Aberdeen was built in '93 when Troupe was busy in the Kootenays. But you can see the stamp of Troupe and the Bulgers and the people he worked with in these vessels, and they had a style and an elegance that was distinctive. You can pick them out. They were, of course, getting ideas from others too, and it was an evolutionary kind of design, but the proportions and the placement of things, the style of the cabins was really elegant. They tried to make them very beautiful. And when you, like in Sicamous or Moyer, the 2 of his boats that are preserved, when you go back and you see how they were decorated, the style of construction, you can see details there that weren't necessary to make a functional boat, but they just worked in a very beautiful way of interior design with the choice of colors, the trim, the gold leaf stenciling that was used. If you go back into Moyer from the 1890s, which is the Victorian era, there was gold leaf stenciling all through the boat and raised plaster decorations in the ladies' cabins.
And you got to keep in mind that it's Holland silver ore and rough cut miners and hard-nosed types in an elegant. This is almost an oxymoron, isn't it? To have this kind of elegance together with that kind of rugged practicality.
These were frontier times, and as you say, they would pull into the bank and pick up a prospector who'd been out for 2 weeks in the bush and probably smelled more like a skunk than you'd want on board. And halfway down the ship was this beautiful dining room with a parquet floor, hardwood parquet floor, and gold leaf stenciling around and chandeliers. And the ladies...
stained glass, colored glass windows, and little knee braces holding up the roofs, and
yes.
polished wood balustrades going up the stairs, banisters.
One of the hallmarks of Troupe's boats were these beautiful staircases. And there's one, of course, in the Sicamous in the forward lounges. And you'll see those in many of his boats, where they were appropriate, of course, for the size of the vessel. But he also used those in the coastal steamships.
Because he was not just involved in creating the fleet for the interior CPR, but the princess boats of the coast became his as well. Take a break here, come back in a second, and talk about that additional responsibility as we talk about Captain James Troupe, the boss of the CPR steamship line. Don't go away. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts talking with Robert Turner about boats, about the man with the CPR who created the interior steamship lines and also the coastal steamship lines. It isn't just a matter of putting a boat on the lake either. It's an infrastructure that he had to create.
That's really the critical question, because the steamboats, first of all, they had to be built somewhere, and you could maybe get away with building one on the riverbank, but you had to pull it out of the water to inspect the hull for federal inspection and to do all the repairs, and it took skilled people to do that. So they in the end had a shipyard at Okanagan Landing, one at Nakusp, big yard at Nakusp for the Columbia River Service, one at Roseberry on Slocan Lake, and another big yard at Nelson, with master builders who were the really experienced managers of the yards, and shipwrights who built all of the cabin work for these vessels, boiler makers, master painters, people who could do the upholstery work, the interior work. They had to be fully independent and be able to service these ships and keep them up to a high standard.
And this is the infrastructure where the huge investment is required. I mean, this is the kind of investment CPR made to run the surface.
That's right. To deal with a ship the size, or a boat the size of the Okanagan, for the Okanagan Lake Service, they'd have 100 people employed when she was in for overhaul at Okanagan Landing. They'd bring in crews from the Kootenays as well, because you couldn't keep that many people in between. And they also had large fleets of tugs and barges for moving the rail cars and the fruit crop when it came in. So it was a big operation. several hundred people employed in the yards in the peak years.
And we never even mentioned the captains and the firemen and the various people who had to work aboard the ship, the crew.
That's right. You'd start out as a laborer and work up to be a shipwright, and you'd be a master carpenter to do that. Most of these boats were, well, all of these, the interior boats had wooden cabins that were built at the local yards from lumber generally brought in from the coast. The clear fir and cedar that was used, just beautiful wood. If you look at the paneling that was in the Sicamous or the Okanagan, it can be 10-inch, 12-inch wide clear cedar that they were using, and beautifully finished. These guys were really skilled craftsmen.
And Troupe had his hand in it. He didn't, he loved every aspect of the business he was in.
Oh, he did. He had his finger in the design, often in a very detailed way, for the construction of all of these boats. And he went to the coast just after the turn of the century to oversee the development of the shipping services there. But even then, he was involved in the design of the Kuskonook and the Okanagan, and then the final 3 big boats for the interior service. He would be consulted about it, and they'd ask his opinion, and what do you think of the design, and is this justified? And the CPR brought him through the interior to do an inspection and report on the service, and so he was very much still in charge, and although he was then centered on the coast.
What kind of a man was he? Because we see him in these pictures as, you know, a tight little man, you know, with a pretty, not a hair out of place.
He was very, very prim and quite handsome as a young man, and I think he continued to be. He kept himself in good shape, but he was a demanding fellow. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He had experienced so much growing up on the river. He knew how to handle boats. He got into the design, and he argued back and forth with shipbuilders in England who were graduate engineers over how these vessels should be built and whether their performance was adequate. That was when he was on the coast. And here in the interior, he would be in the drafting room sketching things up and deciding just on the placement of details. So he did pay attention to the details, and he was a tough manager. But at the same time, he could be hard on his crews if they made a mistake. But he was also very supportive of them. And when he was on the coast, and there was criticism from Thomas Shaughnessy, who was the president, over ships running onto the rocks a few times, he wrote back to head office, to Shaughnessy, offering to resign and saying, "Why do you think we pay the highest insurance rates anywhere in the world for operating on the northwest coast? It's because it's a dangerous place, and we have to expect the ships to run into the rocks occasionally. And there's nothing I can do to stop it short of going and running these ships myself. Essentially, if you don't like it, tough, I'm leaving." Which took a fair bit of courage, but that was Troupe. He didn't hesitate to shoot back at management if he felt they weren't being fair. So he really would stand up for his crews. But the other side, he could be a demanding boss and a tough guy to work for.
Yeah. When he went down onto the coast, of course, I remember the end of the Princess ships traveling aboard the Princess Patricia and the Princess Marguerite in the 50s. But he started the Princess boats on the coast 1903.
Yes, that's right. He'd been established his reputation in the interior, and then when CPR first leased in 1901 and then took over in 1903, they took Troupe down to the coast and essentially gave him a free hand to build up a coastal steamship service that the CPR would be proud of and would make money for them too. And he did just that. He really determined to make it the best he possibly could. And he still had to persuade management of how much money it was going to take and the style of ships. So his first real project, a major project, was the Princess Victoria, which proved to be just a beautiful, well-designed ship. She was built in Britain and came out without her cabins or superstructure, just the steel hull and weatherproofing. And all that was put on in Vancouver and in Victoria. The finishing work was done. She even went into service before all her cabins were finished.
But it was something he demanded they be do, because I think CPR just said, put her in service, don't finish her up.
They were going to be content at that stage with a fairly simple interior design, and simple cabins, and he would have none of it. He talked to his friend Francis Rattenbury, who designed the Parliament buildings, and they came up with a much more elegant interior design. And he said, if we're going to do it, we've got to pay attention to the details and make it work. And if we do that, the public will respond and give us the patronage to pay for it. CP management agreed in the end, and they produced this just gorgeous ship. It was also a very well-engineered vessel. She ran for nearly 50 years with the same engines, original boilers. The hull was still in good shape. She'd just worn herself out by the end of that time and was more obsolete in function than she was ready for the boneyard. But a beautiful ship that just set the pattern for this service for the next 50 years.
If he did it right the first time, he was going to do it right every time after that. We're going to take a break here and talk about all the other times, because the Princess Fleet really was the extension of everything that was elegant about the CPR and its linen and china and everything. And we're going to talk about the other Princess boats and Troupe's involvement with them right after these words. Welcome back to Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with Bob Turner talking about the CP Fleet and Captain James Troupe, who created it. He didn't build his boats on the coast, as you've already pointed out. He bought them from, he was confident in Scottish workmanship.
That's right.
Tyne, Clydebank.
Most of the ships came from Britain, from those traditional yards on the Tyne and the Clyde. John Brown, Fairfield were some of the major builders, and they did do good work. Some ships were done here, the Royal, the Beatrice, the McQuina in those early days, and the Louise in the 20s. They couldn't get a berth, as they would call it, at the shipyards at that point, and so the Louise was done. Beautiful job, too. That was North Vancouver.
Now, these ships, once built in Scotland, had to make it across the Atlantic, so they had their sea trials in some pretty severe conditions.
Oh yes, the early ones had to come all the way around the Horn. Later they could come through Panama, which helped a lot, but it was a long delivery voyage. They planked them up with plywood over the windows and prepared them for that. And by the time they got here, they were pretty sure whether or not it was going to work or not.
Well, some of these pictures you see, the rust streaking down because they've been at sea now for 3 months or something getting here. Mm-hmm. So Troupe then said, let's whip these into the condition necessary for what we need. What did we need? What was the scenario on the coast, Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, that they tried to serve?
There were really two kinds of service. There was the intercity runs, which was primarily Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle. They called it the Triangle Service. That was their high-speed intercity one. And also Vancouver, Nanaimo was the other one like that. And then there were the runs up the west coast of Vancouver Island and the Inside Passage to Skagway and Prince Rupert and all around the Gulf of Georgia, serving the little out-of-the-way communities where there were canneries and fishing camps and logging camps, mining camps. There was kind of that remote service and then the intercity one. They also tried very hard to attract tourists because that was a good source of revenue. They were very good at that, as CPR was in the Rockies and in Banff and places like that. They put out really attractive brochures and come and see the beauties of the West Coast in the summertime when you wouldn't get seasick too much and things like that. And they had their fine dining on board. So they were determined to get all the sources of revenue they could.
Now, did Troupe create these routes themselves? Because I'm thinking 1903, what was being created on the coast of British Columbia then? A lot of very small communities, fishing communities, logging communities, canneries. And did he say, we're going to drop into them all?
Well, the services were more or less in place when he started, but they were certainly expanded, and the frequency of the service was improved dramatically, as was the quality, because some of the boats that were there when he took over were really old tubs, probably more cockroaches on board than passengers. And new ships like the Vic and the Royal and the McQuina that came along were just an enormous improvement for the people in the area. What he did do was put two vessels, say, on the Triangle Run, and they would, Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, and they would be going in opposite directions around this triangle. So it was a double daily service. So it was really a vast improvement. The ships were much faster, say doing a run in 4 hours instead of 7 or 8, which had been the norm of the 90s, with boats where there'd be a candle burning in the dining room instead of electric lights and things like that.
And of course, having them pass each other gave an awful good opportunity to wave to one another and advertise the fleet as it went by.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Very smart. He had, drop a few more names for me while you can, because in addition to the Victoria and the McQuina, the Kathleen, some other ships which are beautiful to look at. To have 3 funnels was often, could be called pretentious in another age, couldn't it?
Oh, yes, yes. There was the Charlotte, sometimes called the honeymoon boat. She had several beautiful suites, and often people living on the island or on the mainland would have their wedding ceremony in the evening. They'd leave on the CPR boat. So it was the beginning of their married life together. Many people look back on Charlotte or the others with great fondness. And there was the Adelaide and the Alice. They were night boats. Later on, there were the Joan and the Elizabeth built. They were really built in 1930. The last one, the Troupe had a hand in. They would sleep 400 people on board and would leave Victoria or Vancouver just at midnight. You could go on the ship in the evening, get an overnight cabin, wake up the next morning at 7 o'clock, coming into or tied up at the dock, have breakfast on board, and then go on about your business. And there was night boat service to Seattle, too. So it was just a lovely way to travel.
Very civilized.
Very civilized, yes.
And in wrapping up, Troupe created this and maybe fortuitously died before he had to start disassembling it.
Yes. He retired in 28. CPR kept him on full salary and consulted with him on various things. And he passed away in 1931 when he was in his mid-70s. And just before the Depression hit, if he had lived longer, there wouldn't have been new boats coming along. The war followed that. There were several really lovely boats built after the war, a new Marguerite and a Princess Pat, Princess of Nanaimo, Princess of Vancouver. But that was when the service was beginning to decline and people were wanting to travel with their automobiles. People were flying to out-of-the-way places. And by the late 1950s, most of the boats had been retired, and the service petered out with the Marguerite remaining on a Seattle service until the late 80s, 89, the Patricia on the Alaska service till 81, and the Vancouver eventually becoming part of the BC Ferries, or Department of Highways, BC Ferries fleet briefly, and then winding up along with the Marguerite on the Seattle service. She's the only one left now, and she's in China. They're all gone.
Bob Turner, I thank you very much. And for those of you wanting to read more about it, Those Beautiful Coastal Liners is Bob's book. And I thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Mike. I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
See you next time on Pioneers and Places.